What if you became a Viking for one day? Today we will dive into the daily life of real Vikings and finally find out who they really were. Dumb, warlike, unwashed barbarians, as Western culture so often describes them. Or perhaps romantic adventurers, with deep customs and advanced technology? Over the course of our journey, we'll examine a few myths, shatter some legends, and at the same time tell facts that may surprise even the most demanding. Did you know that the Vikings discovered America 500 years before Columbus? Get ready. We're going to have even more exciting information in the next couple minutes. Stay tuned, because today we're going to meet our guest, Gylfi Sigurdsson. The action takes place in the year 844, and our hero is in a small Scandinavian village on the outskirts of the town of Hedeby, which is territorially located in modern-day Germany, not far from the border. And yes, you heard right, when it comes to Vikings, the Norwegians, or maybe even the Swedes, immediately come to mind. However, Denmark can also boast of this role, as they had just as much influence. The city of Hedeby, where our Delphi lives, was one of the three main Viking cities spoken of in the sagas. The other two were in Norway and Sweden. Finland, on the other hand, although subject to Viking raids and influence at times, is not directly related to the Vikings. Before we begin, let's briefly define who the Vikings are. In common parlance, they are sea robbers who raided all over the world between the 8th and 11th century AD. This is not a metaphor, as Viking visits to Persia and Africa as well as the New World are documented. Broadly speaking, the Vikings were a people who lived in Scandinavia and had their own states and complex structure. However, it was not a unified empire like the Roman Empire. Vikings are also considered to be the tribes of the Baltic Slavs, who also made sea raids. So the term Vikings is in a sense a generalization for people leading a similar lifestyle. The term Vikings itself comes from the Norwegian language, and scientists are still arguing about its exact interpretation. Modern DNA studies show that the ancient Vikings were genetically closer to the inhabitants of Central Europe and northern Russia. However, these studies are still subject to change. Now let's move on to what is known for sure. The Scandinavian runes represent a complete alphabet that was used for a millennium and a half. Even some villages in Sweden used runes only 100 years ago. The Codex Runicus, containing records of laws and customs, has been well studied by scholars, and today we have a complete understanding of Viking writing. Let's get to the name of our Gylfi Sigurdsson. It's no secret that the Vikings were a very devout people, and although their religion had its own peculiarities, the deity Thor played an important role. We'll talk about the gods later. Now let's talk about names. As in other cultures, Viking children were often named after their gods. For example, you could meet girls named Thor and boys named Ragnar or even Torbjorn. The name Inga deserves a special mention, the roots of which also go back to the same era. Our Gylfi is named after the god of the seas. Also in the future, this name may become associated with the mythical Viking king, who met even with Odin himself. As for the surname Sigurdsson, it's not as epic as it may seem. It simply means that Gylfi's father was called Sigurd. In Icelandic tradition, adding the ending son or daughter for daughters to the father's name gave a ready-made surname for sons. It was a system of identifying a person's belonging to his family. An equally interesting fact is that modern Iceland preserves this tradition, and the composition of the country's soccer team sometimes brings a smile. It is important to note that for the Vikings, family was of the utmost importance. The land on which Gylfi works belongs to him by law. This practice largely helped the Vikings avoid the feudal system that characterized the European part of the continent. Vikings tended to settle as families, and several generations lived together. The houses they lived in were long wooden structures divided into rooms. The family gathered around the hearth for cooking and socializing. Vikings were used to a modest life, and they farmed and kept livestock alternately to ensure survival. The complexities of the geography of the northern territories played a huge role in their way of life. Growing wheat was difficult in the northern regions, and even today only a small portion of the land is suitable for agriculture. In such conditions, the Vikings had to actively engage in raids and trade by sea, which allowed them to survive and provide for their needs. The geographical features of Scandinavia, such as fjord bark and unfavorable land, greatly influenced the historical context of the region. For the people of those times, It was much easier to use a ship and travel to a neighboring village than to travel overland, bypassing obstacles. Roman merchants sailing on ships could associate them with danger, like attacks by pirates, and also the fear that they might drown. The Vikings had a completely opposite attitude towards ships. For them, sailing on ships was far preferable to traveling over land. Of course, climbing rocks was much more difficult and costly than sailing calmly on a ship. It was common for almost every family to have their own ship, or to have connections with people who had ships. This was essential to their survival and provisioning. It is also worth looking into the myths and stereotypes that are often associated with Vikings. Modern TV series and Christian propaganda sometimes portray that the Vikings were constantly fighting and killing each other. In fact, while there were not always clear laws in Viking villages, there were conflict resolution mechanisms in place throughout much of the land. Unjustified killing often resulted in banishment or even harsher punishments. This is a far cry from what is sometimes portrayed in the movies. The second detail that the series presented in a positive light, unlike many of the books, is the role of women in Viking society. The Vikings deserve credit here, as the Scandinavian people were one of the first in history to come up with true equality and establish marriage contracts. Our Gylfi Sigurdsson has a bride named Kraka who lives in a neighboring village. They are in love with each other, and unlike common practice in Europe, the choice of partner was mutual. It did not matter only the choice of the man, but also the desire of the woman. In Viking society, patriarchy prevailed, and the final decision on the choice of a wife was made by the head of the family. In practice, however, a girl was not given in marriage without her consent, and the decision was often made by fathers or older brothers. This is because for the Vikings, a wife was not just a toy. She was the one who looked after the family home, while the husband could spend months and even years on campaigns, raising the children to be true warriors. The famous Koning Ragnar Lothbrok used to say, "I have chosen for my sons such a mother who has passed on her fearlessness to them," and this was not just an empty statement. A woman was a full member of society. Even from ancient laws it has come down to us that even touching the hand of a Scandinavian woman was punishable by a fine of 5 marks. At the conclusion of marriage, a similar marriage contract was created. According to it, the groom set aside a share of his property for his beloved, called a woman's gift. This gesture represented a friendly gift, which the future husband paid to the bride's father for the right to redeem her. In turn, the father would release his daughter with a dowry. Discussing the details of the wedding resembled a real bargain. All in all, marriage was a real headache for the Gylfi, and the situation was complicated by the fact that youth was not considered a positive attribute. While in Europe marriages were often arranged as early as 10 years old, Vikings preferred to make unions closer to 30. This was for logical reasons. A man who lived to that age had a better chance of surviving the campaign than an 18-year-old youth. Often there were delayed marriages, when the young were engaged, but the official wedding was celebrated in a few years. It should be noted that the TV series, Vikings, clearly conveyed another important detail. In the absence of a husband, a woman could also lead a campaign by taking up a sword. Now let's get to what everyone has been waiting for. It is the year 844, and Denmark is ruled by the very Ragnar Lothbrok, the main character of the series. However, in reality, he was not a simple Viking, but the son of Sigurd the Ring, the past ruler of Denmark. His official title was Koning, which by European standards translates as king. It is worth noting that there is no reliable information about his existence, but other historical facts confirm the Viking conquests. For example, the conquest of Paris by the Vikings. In brief, the mechanism of any campaign was the same. Our Gylfi is raising sheep and meets a messenger from another village who summons people to go on a campaign. Gylfi, along with the other combat-ready villagers, packs up, loads onto a ship, and follows the ruler, if the campaign was large-scale. In this case we are talking about a large-scale Viking invasion of France. Europe was used to such raids. And, unfortunately, Christian propaganda is true here. Vikings really burned whole villages, devastating them to the last drop of grain. In Latin there was even a common prayer beginning with the words, "Save us, Lord, from the wrath of the savage people of the Normans who dwell in the north." At the sight of Viking ships on the horizon and preparing for battle, it was said, "There is a theory that it is to the Vikings we owe the emergence of states in the modern form." After the fall of Rome in Europe, in the face of the Scandinavian threat, rulers structured life, logistics, and village defenses to defend themselves effectively. Let's go back to 845, when Gylfi Sigurdsson, led by a couple thousand warriors, marched on Paris with Ragnar Lothbrok. Let's break down a few stereotypes associated with Vikings. The main one is the image of Vikings as untrained barbarians behaving like brigands. Yes, in about 50% of the cases this was indeed the case. However, in the other 50% of cases, the Vikings were outstanding tacticians. They were able to stand up to British, French, and other regular armies. Konung Ragnar even had his own spy service for intelligence, and he kept instructions for the Vikings, not to destroy villages, but to demand ransom. This was justified logically. After a few years, the Vikings could return to the same place again and repeat the process. Let's consider the capture of Paris in 845. In this case, although we have taken the events from the TV series, it should be noted that it is far from historically accurate. In the TV series, the Vikings organized a fake burial of the leader Ragnar and under the guise of a funeral procession entered Paris. A similar situation did take place in history, but with the purpose of capturing not Paris, but Rome. It happened after Ragnar's death. The Vikings, led by his son Bjorn the Iron-Skinned, decided to conquer Rome. Bjorn gathered 62 ships, landed in Italy, and arranged a fictitious burial for himself. This allowed them to enter Rome. However, in reality, they made a mistake and took not Rome, but the Italian city of Luna. As for taking Paris, that was a more classical way of doing it. Ragnar was an excellent strategist, and his spies brought him news of internal rebellions in France. At this time, there was a power struggle in France between three factions. Eventually, in 845, Gylfi Sigurdsson and his troops approached the city of Paris, where they encountered scattered units of the French. With some nifty tactical maneuvers, the Vikings destroyed the enemy and stormed the city. Rather than fight, King Charles the Bald, who was in the city, chose to pay Ragnar Lothbrok a large ransom. Thus, Gylfi returned home with a ship loaded with gold. On the way home, Ragnar's army burned every French town they came across. Sometimes the Vikings staged full-fledged sieges, waiting until the supplies in the cities were depleted and the troops were weakened. Regarding hygiene, another common myth, Christian propaganda painted the Vikings as unhygienic and unwashed. The truth is that the Vikings paid attention to hygiene. Gylfi even had a special comb for his beard. Archaeologists find personal hygiene items such as combs at excavation sites of Viking cities. Even a 13th-century English chronicler named John recorded that Vikings were neat and tidy, making it easy for them to win the hearts of English women. Note that there are also many missteps in the Vikings series. Ragnar Lothbrok, depicted in the series, is shaved and bald, although true Vikings would have called him Ragnar Bald and ridiculed him. After all, a shaved head indicated that either the guy was a criminal or a slave. A true Viking should have proudly worn a thick head of hair. And now comes the next stage for Gylfi, the second campaign in France. However, this campaign was less successful. Half of the troops died of dysentery, and the second time to take Paris failed. But the Vikings successfully colonized Iceland and Greenland. There is also documentary evidence of Viking settlements in these lands. In 1000, Leif Erikson landed in Newfoundland, which is located on the territory of modern Canada. By circumnavigating Greenland, the Vikings reached North America long before Columbus. This event was confirmed in the saga of Eric the Red. The stories about Gylfi Sigurdsson could be told endlessly, but we have a limit within the confines of this video. If you want to hear more of his story, leave a comment, give us a like and wait for part 2 of our video. See you soon, friends. Thanks for watching.